Welcome back to Punk Rock Theologian. Today we're continuing the exploration of why we know we can trust the Bible, specifically the Gospels. Not surprisingly, we're starting off with Matthew, but a number of the things I'm going to show you here actually apply to all of them, and frankly to the whole Bible. It's just an idea of how history really works, what historical documents are really like. Some of the complaints that skeptics throw at the Bible just make no sense. They'll argue that, well, there's nothing here says that Matthew wrote it, or when he wrote it, or where he wrote it. We have no idea any of this. It's like, of course not, because no one writes history that way. No historian includes themselves in the book as the author. Matthew was fully aware that he's not the main character in this story. That doesn't mean he doesn't show up in the story. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record Matthew as the tax collector. I'll give you Matthew's own version in Matthew 9:9. He says, as Jesus was walking along, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at his tax collector's booth. Follow me and be my disciple, Jesus said to him. So Matthew got up and followed him. You see the exact same thing in Mark 2:14 and Luke 5:27. They all share the story that Matthew was a tax collector. Jesus called him. He left that job, followed Jesus from then on out. It also includes that he threw a party and invited Jesus to meet all of his rough crowd friends, which is part of the indicator that Matthew is exactly the kind of guy that we want for the historian. He's the person whose life was impacted, and he was an eyewitness. He was right there. He saw the things Jesus did. He heard the things Jesus said. And since he was a tax collector professionally, this is the guy who was accustomed to keeping detailed accounts. He had to keep records of what he collected and when and from whom and all of these kind of things. It was part of his background. And so it makes perfect sense that he's the first one that was called on to write a memoir of Jesus. And that's actually what it was at the point that he wrote it. Justin Martyr in the 2nd century frequently refers to Matthew's work and he calls it a memoir of Jesus. While I freely admit, we don't have like Matthew's original manuscript with a signature or anything like that, but even though we are so far removed from it and we don't have the direct connection, that doesn't mean that there's nothing left. Because the people who lived then, the early church, highly valued the memoir of Jesus that Matthew wrote. And while we don't have detailed records on who wrote it, where he wrote it, when he wrote it, they absolutely knew all of those details. What we call the church fathers, the early leaders in the first couple centuries, people who knew the apostles and their companions, they unanimously declared that Matthew wrote this gospel. He wrote it at Jerusalem for the Christian church there that was a very large but very poor church. And so he wrote it in their native dialect. They weren't really well educated. And he wrote it before the destruction of Jerusalem that happened in 70 AD. For the nerds who care, we have that from Papias, the disciple of John, the companion of Polycarp, then Irenaeus, the disciple of Polycarp, Origen, the disciple of Irenaeus. Continuing the chain on out, there's Eusebius, Jerome, Cyril, Chrysostom, Augustine. All of these people have documents that we still have, and we can see from them the evidence of who wrote it, when he wrote it, where he wrote it. All of it is corroborated by them. I talked last week about the Gaelic Wars and the Aeneid, but you can take your pick of any ancient document, and we don't have as much evidence for the authorship and the time and place and the specific details as we do for the 4 Gospels. And you can even see from the writing that it totally fits. For starters, if you pay attention in the Greek, it's written like a businessman. Matthew wrote like this guy Matthew would write. And we can tell that it's written to the Jerusalem church, to these Jews, because of how frequently he refers to Jewish customs and scriptures, but never explains them. A dozen different times he talks about, well, this fulfilled this prophecy, but that's all he says about it. He assumes that his audience knew these prophecies. And so for this to be written to the Jerusalem church means that it had to come late enough that there is a big enough church there. So it's been a little while after 33 AD. We know it was written before 70 AD because the whole thing is written as though Jerusalem exists exactly as it did during Jesus' lifetime. The most telling thing is Matthew chapter 24. I won't give you the whole thing, but let's just look at the first couple verses. As Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings. But he responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." The thing is, that literally physically happened in 70 AD. General Titus, who went on to become Roman Emperor Titus, conquered Jerusalem in 70 AD. The temple and most of the city was burned to the ground, and the gold of the temple melted down into the rocks. And to recover that gold, he sent his soldiers to pry the stones apart and get the gold out. And so literally what Jesus said, not one stone was left on top of another. Matthew was all about fulfilled prophecies. If he knew about this prophecy being fulfilled so perfectly, he for sure would have said it. But he didn't know about it because when he was writing, it hadn't happened yet. So that means we've got it narrowed down to somewhere between like 40 and 70 AD. That's an amazingly small window for a document 2,000 years old, that we know that closely who wrote it, where he wrote it, when he wrote it. It's incredible that we have this level of detail. There is more reason to trust Matthew's story in the Gospel of Matthew than there is to trust that Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, any of these guys said any of the things we think they said. Don't be thrown off by a silly argument of, oh, it's so old we can't trust it. If history is a thing at all, and it is, we can trust Matthew.